We spent the weekend with my in-laws. I was sleeping on the kitchen floor as usual, father-in-law. Why are you sleeping here, dear? Me. Because I'm a useless wife. He's furious and... No infertile woman deserves to sleep in the same room as her husband. Yes, I agree. It's because you're that naive and dangle false hope in front of your own eyes that makes you unable to have kids, no matter how much treatment you take. Please, no. I was left alone in the excruciatingly cold living room with the stove taken away into the sleeping quarters of my husband and mother-in-law, and I laid down in the kitchen to try to sleep with a thin blanket over my body to keep the cold at bay. Is that you, Grace? What are you doing sleeping out here? When I woke up, I found my father-in-law, who was supposed to be on a business trip overseas, towering over me. Although I had just woken up from hypothermic slumber, I answered his question without hesitation, and with tears welling in my eyes. Because I am a useless wife, sir. I was told that the kitchen floor is a good enough place for an infertile bitch like me to sleep. My father-in-law was so astonished that he was speechless for a few seconds. Then he understood my situation and, enraged, made me a proposal. This is the story of how my husband and mother-in-law gave me such a hard time that I was physically and mentally exhausted, and in response to their various forms of abuse, I would partner up with my father-in-law, devise a foolproof plan, and give the two traitors a give of their own medicine. My name is Grace, and I'm a 30-year-old housewife. I used to work part-time at a local supermarket from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. on weekdays, and I used to live with my husband Edward, better known as Eddie, in a rented condo. Throughout the whole of my marriage, I visited my parents-in-law's house, which was one station away, every day to take care of my mother-in-law, Mrs. Russell. Mr. Russell is an executive officer of a foreign investment company and goes on overseas business trips every week. I'm so lonely, doing the housework all alone. Go and help Mom out, will you, Grace? Eddie is a trading company employee, and although he does work overtime frequently, he rarely travels outside the city, let alone overseas, so he often came home to his parents' house on Fridays for dinner with his mother and myself. I met my husband at trading company he worked at. I had just graduated and was hired as a full-time receptionist at the company, and while I only saw Eddie perhaps once every few months for the first year or so, he was promoted in his third year working for the company and was beginning to visit his clients more and more. This evidently made him pass in front of the receptionist desk every day, and the more we saw each other, the more interested we became with each other, and over time, we gradually became friends. It was me who confessed I had feelings for him. He was pretty exactly my type when it came to looks, and the fact that I saw off going out on business every day proved to me that he was a responsible, hardworking, trustworthy guy. Luckily, he was also infatuated with me, as it turned out, and after nearly 3 years of dating, we got married 3 years ago. I resigned from my job soon thereafter and became a part-timer at a nearby supermarket. Such was my life with Eddie, but I had a big problem. It was that I wasn't blessed with a child. I started wanting to become pregnant as soon as I got married, but the results were not as good as I had hoped. And as we kept on trying, 2 years had already passed. After discussing it with my husband, we went to a hospital last year and found out that there was a problem with me. I promptly signed up for fertility treatment after some consultation with our doctor, and I underwent such treatment for a full year. And I wish that was the only problem I had, but unfortunately it wasn't. After we found out that the cause of our being unable to conceive a child was me, Eddie and Mrs. Russell began to explicitly harass me. The bathroom is dirty, Grace. You get over here and clean it up. I'm going out to dinner with some friends today, and I need you to drive me to and from. Mrs. Russell would frequently call me and ask me to come over to her house to take care of this and that, all of which were unnecessary. With Eddie, on the other hand, it went like this. We're going to have to spend a lot of money on your damn fertility treatments, Grace. So from this month on, you're not going to get an allowance. I'm giving you a strong, minimal living allowance, so you'll have to make do with that. And so the only money I had at my disposal for myself was the change that was left from the grocery shopping at the supermarket. So after we started fertility treatment, my daily routine became such that I did my chores at home in the morning, then went to my part-time job or the hospital, and on my way home, I went to my in-laws' house to do chores again. And every time I visited Eddie's family home, Mrs. Russell would only continuously make sarcastic comments about my infertility. One day it would go like this. When will I get to see my grandchildren, Grace? I'm currently undergoing treatment, Mrs. Russell. I feel sorry for Eddie. Looks like we won't be able to have any children ever. Another day it would go like this. You're so late. If you can't have any children, at least do the housework properly, you stupid bitch. I was working part-time today, Mrs. Russell. How dare you consider a responsibility of yours? It's just a damn easy-ass job at the supermarket, isn't it? Don't you dare get your hands full with such a low-level job that literally anyone can do. You're so pathetic. Seeing my mother-in-law like this, it was as if she took pleasure in harassing me mercilessly. This kind of harassment sometimes took place in front of her son, but he always turned a blind eye to it. And even during instances when Mrs. Russell wasn't actually harassing me, but instead was kindly giving me helpful advice, Eddie would aggressively cut into the conversation, snapping, "Why can't you listen to Mom, Grace, eh? You're my damn wife. It's only natural that you listen to her and appreciate her help." He always maintained a mama's boy attitude and never failed to morally harass me when Mrs. Russell wasn't. It was as though his mother was his absolute boss, and that any objection to what she'd ever say was punishable by soul-crushing. One Friday evening in winter, when we were having dinner at my parents' house as usual, Mrs. Russell said, "Your father is going on a business trip to Singapore this weekend, Eddie dear, and won't be able to come home tonight. I'm going to be lonely tonight, all by myself. So you guys stay over tonight, okay?" Usually, Mr. Russell came back from his overseas business trips by noon on Saturday, but not this week. Perhaps some urgent change in plans caused him to delay his return home. To this suggestion, my husband replied, "Of course, Mom. I'm sure Grace would love to too. Wouldn't you, Grace?" I found myself unable to answer. His gaze seemed to drill a painful hole into my chest, suggesting that any form of possible rejection would be met with dire consequences. With a few words and a fearful death stare, the idea of living together seemed to be set in stone. Of course, I wanted to leave that damn house of misery as soon as possible, so I tried to refuse. "But I didn't bring anything to stay over, Mrs. Russell." Eddie knocked on the table with his index finger, and the gaze in his eyes became even more murderous than a few seconds prior. Such a stare obviously ignited a blue flame of pure fear for my sanity, if not my life, so I reluctantly agreed to stay over that night. But just as I was bracing myself for anything, I could not have expected how truly nightmarish things were about to be. When the meal was over, as a matter of course, I took away the dishes by myself and proceeded to the kitchen to wash all the dishes. Each and every plate, saucer, bowl, fork, spoon, knife, glass, pots, pans, and jugs needed at least 60 seconds of washing and scrubbing before they were to be dried completely by hand and put away in the cupboards above the kitchen counter. This meant that one dishwashing session would take half an hour at least, and if Mrs. Russell was feeling generous, that would be it. But she was never generous, and there were always at least 10 dishes that needed to be washed again for another minute straight. Only when Mrs. Russell approved of everything was I able to go on to the next chore. Such a dishwashing session was underway, and meanwhile, Mrs. Russell had a bath before Eddie did himself. I finally finished the dishes 45 minutes later, took a bath in water that wasn't particularly pleasant in appearance and in temperature, and when I came out of the bath, they were no longer in the living room. I thought they were in the large communal bedroom, and as I went there, I overheard Eddie and his mother having a conversation that went like this. "We only have a futon for your father and myself, Eddie dear. You sleep on your father's futon, okay?" "Got it, Mom. Thanks a lot." I had a bad feeling about this, so I immediately asked a question. Where should I sleep?" My mother-in-law and husband looked at me coldly in eerie sync. No infertile woman deserves to sleep in the same room as her husband. Yes, I agree. It's because you're that naive and dangle false hope in front of your own eyes that makes you unable to have kids, no matter how much treatment you take. Please, no. They proceeded to act as though they didn't see me at all, and moved the heater in the living room to their sleeping quarters impatiently and closed the door. "Oh, hell no," I murmured, and as these words spilled from my mouth, tears spilled down my cheeks. I tried to get comfortable under the dirty kitchen rug on the blisteringly cold hardwood floor, and did what I could think of to keep winter's night cold out. Falling asleep was a Herculean task, but my physical and mental exhaustion eventually overwhelmed me, and a shallow sleep enveloped as I pulled the stiff, prickly rug over my head. After that day, their harassment worsened, and they started treating me as though I were their own personal slave. And it was always on days when Mr. Russell was not around. "This potato soup tastes too weak. Get up, make it again. You're wasting your time on nonsense again, Grace. Hurry up already and frickin' clean our house." Every day, I just endured the relentless abuse from both of them. Perhaps the hospital noticed something about my demeanor, because they suggested the option of lessening the pace of infertility treatment. "How about taking it easy with treatment, Mrs. Russell? I believe you're working too hard every day nowadays, and the physical and mental stress seems to be getting to you." My OBGYN was Dr. Yates, and she was a very compassionate, caring woman. She gently placed her rubber-gloved fingers against my face, just under my eyes, and shook her head with concern. I wanted to tell her everything. How I was being harassed and abused at home, how I wasn't getting any sleep at night because of the excruciating cold, and how all of these things was making physically and mentally feel like a wreck. But the cause of all this is that the possibility of me having children was low. If only I could have a child, I would be free from this hell. I believed that with all my heart and soul, and chose to continue the treatment without hesitation, without ever slowing down and taking it easy. Life went on terribly, until one Friday winter night, when a huge stroke of luck changed everything. As usual, Mr. Russell was not coming home that weekend, so I was obviously going to spend the night in the kitchen again. It was February, the coldest month of the year, and it was snowing outside. There was no way I could get a good night's sleep in such conditions, and indeed, I didn't. I shivered in the cold without getting a wink of sleep until early in the morning, waiting for the sun to shine onto my face. That's when I heard the front door open with a rattling sound. A burglar? No shot. As I just lay frozen in more than one way, with the cold and the fear of the visitor being sinister, I found myself unable to move. Silent footsteps approached, and the door of the living room opened. "Is that you, Grace? What are you doing sleeping out here?" I found my father-in-law, Mr. Russell, who was supposed to be on a business trip overseas, towering over me. He looked even more surprised than I was, and asked me that question with widened eyes. Although I had just woken up from a hypothermic slumber, I answered his question without hesitation, and with tears welling in my eyes. "Because I am a useless wife, sir. I was told that the kitchen floor is a good enough place for an infertile bitch like me to sleep." These were the words that came out of my mouth, and I couldn't keep the tears at bay any longer. A slight silence passed between the two of us. Then my father-in-law wrinkled his brows, as though he realized something, and said quietly, "Not here, my dear. Let's go outside and have a long talk." Without making a sound, we left the house with Mr. Russell's arms around me, quickly rubbing my back and shoulders in an effort to warm me up. He retrieved a blanket from the trunk of the car, and we went into a nearby family restaurant that was open 24 hours. "Let's get something hot to start off. You must be, well, cold. How about this corn soup?" "Yes, please, thank you." He called for the waiter, ordered the soup and some hot sandwiches, and after he was done, "I'm sorry if I startled you. I had a sudden change of plans and boarded a plane bound for New Orleans last night. I then got on a late-night bus and I came home." "Oh, I see." Mr. Russell glanced at me, snapped the restaurant menu shut, and slowly opened his mouth. "So, about my wife and son, they were always being disrespectful to you, were they not?" These words touched a fragile part of my heart, and almost by reflex, I burst into tears. "Oh, my dear Grace, tell me everything that happened." I sipped my corn soup with croutons as I told him, tell me everything that had happened for the last year. How Mrs. Russell had been badgering me since she found out I was infertile. How Eddie had taken advantage of my situation with the treatments by no longer giving me an allowance. And went into especially intricate detail about how much I hated being treated like a household slave, and how I wasn't allowed to sleep on the futon and that I had to make do with the kitchen rug. Mr. Russell listened to the whole story with attentive concern, occasionally giving me a grave nod of his head. When I had finished, he placed his forehead on his hands and slowly opened his mouth. My wife has always had a tendency to do things her own way, and if things didn't go the way she wanted, she would be unreasonable, cruel, and aggressive. She spoiled Edward, and he grew up the same way. So that's how it was, sir. Yeah, it was. To be completely honest with you, as the years passed, I grew to hate her. I consider us married only legally. All the love I once had for her is gone. I couldn't stand to be home with her all the time, so I searched frantically for this position 10 years ago. A job position which requires a lot of travel overseas. What? I was speechless. I had no idea that my normally mild-mannered father-in-law had such thoughts and feelings. When my father-in-law finished telling me about his past, he made me a certain proposal. Yes, I understand. Let's do it right away. After that, we had a strategy meeting and we went our separate ways for the time being. I returned to my in-laws' house before Eddie and his mother woke up, and as Mr. Russell had instructed me to do, I took the helm, acting as though nothing had happened. Mr. Russell himself was to take the week off. He was able to because he had a few months of paid leave to make up for, and stay at a business hotel and return home on Sunday, as originally planned. The next week, we put our plan into action. The three of us, without Mr. Russell, had a normal weekend. The only difference is that I had something special in my pocket at all pockets. Oh, look, the infertile Grace making love with the kitchen rug again tonight, is she? Lol. I'm moving the heater to the bedroom again, Grace. You don't mind, right? No. And the two of them went to sleep without knowing even a smidge of what was going on. At dawn, I snuck out of my parents-in-law's house and met Mr. Russell, who was waiting at a nearby business hotel under the pretense of being gone on usual business overseas. Now then, Grace, did you prepare the thing? Yes, I prepared it well. I took out the audio recorder in my pocket and pressed play. In the recording was the behavior of both Eddie and Mrs. Russell not 6 hours ago. Not only that, it contained most of the evidence of harassment for the last week. Yes, indeed, I had been visiting my parents-in-law's house with an audio recorder in my pocket for the past week, and this was exactly what Mr. Russell had made as step one on our grand plan to get back at the traitors. He listened to the whole thing, which took around an hour, and after it was finished, he said with a big sigh, "I had no idea that they had been so harsh with you for so long, Grace. I should have known sooner and done something about it. I'm so sorry. I'm ready to put things right now. No, sir, it's not your fault. If anything, I should be thanking you. You're the one saving me from this misery after all. Thank you so much. Oh, please, no need to thank me. Besides, the mission isn't over yet. Let's proceed on to phase Armageddon." "Yes, sir." I nodded, squeezing the recorder, and we returned to my in-laws' house with determination in our hearts. As soon as we opened the front door, Mr. Russell strode into the communal bedroom and woke the two snakes. "Is that you, Noah? But why? What about your business trip?" Mrs. Russell said, rubbing her eyes sleepily. "I need to talk to you both. It's urgent. Just get your ass into the living room." They trudged out into the cold living room, not understanding what was going on, and I stood beside Mr. Russell as we held out 2 sheets of green paper that we had prepared for them. The moment they saw the papers, all sense of sleepiness seemed to disappear as they jumped up in alarm. Eddie turned pale while Mr. Russell turned red. "What are you insinuating here? A divorce? Over my dead body? What have I ever done to you, Noah? What the hell have I done wrong? If you divorce me, I'm going to demand a large portion of your property and alimony, so help me, I will." Mrs. Russell snarled and yelled at her husband. "What's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? You really don't realize what you've done, do you? What the hell do you mean? What the hell did I do?" Mr. Russell and I made eye contact in front of them both and played back the audio recording. The two traitors broke out in a cold sweat and fell silent during the recorded conversation that ensued. I looked at them coldly and said, "We have plenty of evidence that you two have been harassing me. If you don't agree to a divorce, there's always the option of taking this to court. I'm sure Noah and I will keep our minds open to that." "Hell yeah, we will." I could see the blood drain from the faces of the two scumbags that slumped before us. As if to push them further into a corner, Mr. Russell added, "I'm also going to sell this house, so Celine, you'll have to get ready to move away within the next few days. And you too, Edward. If you have any belongings here, get rid of them." "Oh, hell no, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Grace. Please forgive me. I'll do anything to make up for what I did." Eddie and his mother both fell to their knees in apologetic tears. He was clinging to my ankle, but I shook him off as I said, "Hey, what are you talking about now, buddy? Do you know how I've been feeling ever since you decided to move in with your mother? Not once did you ask for my honest opinion, and on top of that you actively disrespected me alongside this other condescending jerk here up until today too. Your apology has absolutely no worth, and even less effect on how I feel about all of this. Even if you were to apologize to me now, it's long past the point where I can forgive you. It's too late for both of you to be sorry. Anyway, I'll get back to you two later on about the future, and I'm staying at a hotel this weekend. I'll get ready to leave the house straight away, so Eddie, you'll spend the weekend here, and then never again. In the meantime, get your damn things packed up, both of you, and don't you dare show your faces in front of me ever again, or so help me I'll make you two rue the day you do." And we left the in-laws' house, leaving the two scumbags with their miserable tear-stained faces. Mr. and Mrs. Russell and Eddie and I officially divorced later that day. After consulting with my lawyer, Mrs. Sprouse, and my OB/GYN, Dr. Yates, the recorder was accepted as evidence that the apparent failure of the infertility treatment was partly caused by the stress from the harassment I was experiencing from my ex-husband and his mother, and I filed a claim for alimony against them both. And as for my parents-in-law's house, it was put on the market immediately, as my Mr. Russell had said he would, and a buyer came within a few days. Mrs. Russell, who had lost her place in the family, came to the apartment where her and I used to live and asked him to let her stay there. Edward is having a hard time financially due to the alimony payments, so he works at his full-time job during the day, and at night he commutes to work as a traffic warden at a construction site. He also started working as a day laborer at a factory on weekends, but a few days ago his overwork took its toll on his body, and he collapsed at his day job and is currently in the hospital. As for Mrs. Russell, she currently works at a supermarket during the day and as a security guard at night. Although she looked down on my part-time job at the supermarket, she probably never imagined at the time that she would be doing the same job herself in the future. As for me, things looked immediately after I divorced Edward. I moved into a beautiful condo and got a full-time job at Mr. Russell Company through his introduction. Remember, Grace, if you ever need help with anything, professional or personal, you just let me know and I'll do whatever I can to help. I'm determined to do my best in this new environment to make my savior, Noah Russell, proud of his decision to get me hired in his workplace. The work seems simple enough, and I can't wait to learn all there is to the company and hopefully hop onto the path towards great success. From now on, I'm not going to be pushed around by others, and I'm going to be the lead character in my own life. That's what I vowed in my heart as I put on my new suit on the morning of my first day at work.